Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to our event with the title, Does the Zeitenwende Mean the End of International Aid? My name is Werner Ratzer. I'm the director of the Austrian Foundation for Development Research, and I would like to thank our cooperation partner, the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue, for hosting and co-organizing tonight's discussion. Actually, it's hardly imaginable to have a better place for this discussion. It was precisely during the government of Bruno Kreisky in the 1970s that the field of development cooperation policy became institutionalized as a field of public policy in Austria. In 1974, we had our first act on development cooperation adopted by the Austrian Parliament. A little later, we had our first kind of bureaucracy established in the Austrian Chancellery, responsible for development cooperation. And we also made, Little Austria made at least sometimes a couple of headlines internationally when, for example, Bruno Kreisky launched his call for the establishment of a Marshall Plan for the so-called Third World at the time, during the discussions on the new international economic order of the 1970s. So thanks to these achievements of these times, already 50 years ago, more or less, Austrian development cooperation became institutionalized. Although, to be honest, Austria never made it into the group of high flyers, so to say, in international development cooperation, like, for example, the Scandinavian countries. But nevertheless, we had a steady performance, more or less in, if you want, the solid middle ground of ODA donors in the OECD world. And we were our kind of development cooperation policy for a long time at least was kind of unaffected by the international ups and downs of development cooperation. And only until recently, I would say, that can be said to be true. But nowadays, it seems that things are really changing. And there is indeed something like a change of times that is also affecting international development cooperation, also in Austria. As you might know, or not might know, given that there were not a lot of kind of media coverage on this, the budget for Austrian bilateral development cooperation and also for Austrian humanitarian aid is going to be cut by more than 30% this year and next year, which basically means a loss of 70 million euros compared to 2024. So that's quite a drastic cut that we are experiencing now. So obviously, it is really important to have a debate about why do we do development cooperation policy? How do we want to do it in the future? In what way do we have to account for the recent geopolitical changes, and how can they be accommodated with the kind of norms and objectives of more classical development cooperation? So I'm very happy that we have this debate tonight with two very internationally distinguished speakers, hosted by Ambassador René Horace. So I'm looking forward to this debate. Thanks a lot for coming, and let's enjoy the evening. Thank you.
I think we can switch off this. Yeah. Thank you very much, Werner, for this very instructive introduction, and also for the good cooperation between the Bruno Kreisky Forum and ÖFSE in the organization of this event. Thank you very much. So I think we go straight into matters, and as Werner said, the beginning of this year has been really a shock in the development world. So not only in Austria, but in particular in the USA. So when Trump administration started, one of the first things they did was shutting down USAID. And USAID was really a big donor, in particular for humanitarian support, but also for development support. And as has been said also, while the Trump shutdown was really the bomb, but there was previously already something going on. So DFID had been shut down several years ago. then, or shut down and incorporated into the Commonwealth Office. Then the Netherlands have shrank their development, cut their development aids. Germany is doing so, Austria is doing so. So the traditional donors, it seems like the traditional donor community is withdrawing from development finance. And very often in the package of development finance, humanitarian finance is also going with it. So and at the same time, we have also other indicators which are very worrying. So the UN has lost its credibility. If somebody has listened to the speeches at the UN on the language on the UN in the General Assembly 2 weeks ago, so and if one follows a little bit what the discussion around the UN, so there is a loss of credibility. They have lost their norm-setting power to some extent, and so we are. Everything looks as if we are facing a kind of the crumbling of the international norm-driven development system and humanitarian system. So does this mean, are we approaching the end of it? So this is the question what we are asking this evening. So what does this mean for developing countries? What does this mean for low-income countries? What does this mean for the people in these countries? But also, how do the countries react? Is anybody else stepping in? What are alternative means for finance? How can developing countries today finance their development, their workplaces for the youth? How can they finance also the necessary climate actions against climate change, which they need and they want to do as well? So there's a lot of things to discuss, and I'm very pleased to welcome my distinguished speakers. So thanks so much, Catherine, for coming. So we have here Dr. Catherine Nwajiako. Did I say it right? Nwajiako Dao. She's the director of ODI Politics and Governance Programs. Catherine is an expert on politics, on peace building, business and human rights, and she has 25 years of experience of working and providing policy advice to multilateral and bilateral institutions and NGOs. So you have been working for OECD, for DFID, for DANIDA, for the African Development Bank, and for Oxfam and Accord as well. So I think you have kind of a whole spectrum of institutions and organizations that you have been working at. Catherine holds a PhD in Politics and International Relations from Nuffield College, from the University of Oxford, and an MA from the London School of Oriental and African Studies. So Dr. Stefan Klingebiel, who is familiar to some of you here already, he heads the research department for Inter- and Transnational Cooperation at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. Previously, he was working at with the United Nations Development Programs in Seoul, and for the office of the German KfW Development Bank in Kigali, in Rwanda. So he is also teaching at several universities. Among others, he was visiting professor at Stanford University and is a visiting professor at University of Turin, Seoul, and you teach presently also at the University in Bonn. So I stop here because you all have such a long CV. So you allowed myself to shorten it a little bit. But to go now into this discussion with these many, many questions that we want to look at this evening. I want to start with you, Catherine. So when at the beginning of this year, I think the real big bang in the development world was really the shutdown of USAID. And many people do not know that many of the health services of African countries depended to a high degree also on US aid, on the PEPFAR program for providing medicines, etc. So can you say just some words about the impact of dismantling US aid and also dismantling DFID and the reduction of development and the humanitarian aid on developing countries and on countries in crisis? Please.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the Kreisky Foundation for inviting me to speak here. This is a topic very close to the heart of my organisation, ODI Global, where I'm the director of the Politics and Governance Programme, but also do quite a lot of work looking at these questions of the future of aid and the locally led development agenda. I really want to begin by just highlighting and leaning into your introductory remarks, where you noted that what we're seeing, whilst dramatic from January onwards, was not the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, ODI has been conducting a series of dialogues on the future post-aid, the post-aid world, before the moment of the shutdown of US aid and everything that happened subsequently. And what we noted was that there was a trend. Already, 2023, there had been a spike in levels of ODA, but that ODA was essentially spiked because it was going to Ukraine and to to donor refugee costs. So there was an inflated spike. And then from 2024 onwards, it started to decline. So we already started to see the writing on the wall, which is why ODI felt it was necessary to start to have this conversation in the context of the whole ethos, what you described as the rationale for aid, being unpicked. And so I want to caveat any comments I make about the impact by saying already, if you look at the context where there was most need, low-income countries, countries emerging from conflict and fragility that were not Ukraine, there was already a bit of a problem in terms of their ability to garner aid resources, humanitarian and development finance, commensurate with their need. So yes, clearly, from 2025 onwards, we see a dramatic decline. You mentioned all the countries involved. So the big DAC donors, OECD DAC donors, France, Germany, the UK and US were all, it was like a domino effect. Everybody seemed to use the cover of the US to do the same. And what's interesting as well is that whilst the impacts, so you asked me to describe the impacts are not yet necessarily all hitting. So whilst on the civil society side, we see, of course, there were some dramatic impacts with organisations seeing their funding slashed overnight. An organisation called EPIC Africa, who did a survey of CSOs across Africa, was clear about some of the consequences where you had, up to half of, NGOs local NGOs finding their funding slashed by at least 50%. Some third not being able to exist anymore. So, some impacts very much felt. And of course, there was a lot of conversation about the impact on health services. It's clear that if you look not just at the cuts that have happened already, but the ones that are going to hit 2025 to 27, we're talking about a 28% to 29% decline in funding for health. So we haven't yet seen the bulk of it. And PEPFAR programme, as very clearly articulated by the head of UNAIDS, was really going to see some big impacts, with government stepping in to cushion some of the blow. Our assessment is that whilst the impacts are likely, it's very difficult at this point to be categorical about what they are, because one, there's a time lag issue, and also the extent to which a lot of the funding was coming directly to governments makes it also difficult. So while programs were getting cut, there's not a significant enough portion of bilateral aid going directly to government. So the impact on government spending is difficult to assess. We're doing quite a lot of work trying to gather that information, but the picture is unclear, concerning but unclear. And I want to make perhaps just one comment on the health situation. So that same question around, which was very, very upfront around HIV and AIDS and funding, it's also quite astounding that in those conversations around that, we also know that some 60% of HIV/AIDS funding in South Africa is funded by the state.
Yeah.
Yes, and there are also commitments, and I'll perhaps come to that later, by governments to step up some of that funding. So my broad conclusion is that yes, we are starting to feel the bite, but it's difficult to quantify and qualify exactly where that's hitting. We know, projection-wise, that health is going to take a big knock, that Africa as well is going to see cuts across the board for up to some 28%. That's going to vary according to the degree of aid dependency of particular countries. For example, we're doing a lot of work on Somalia right now, and it's clear that humanitarian as well as development finance is going to really hit Somalia. But we're trying to do the evidencing of that in order to be able to have a comprehensive story. Again, the government, the Ministry of Finance, working closely with the Ministry of Finance on this, they're trying to understand the impact of the cuts in terms of what it means for revenues on the fiscal side, for all the architecture of USAID as well as other humanitarian programs that are going to be cut and will have a consequential impact on fiscal revenues. So, but the picture is unclear at the moment. That's what I would say.
You want to add something on that, Stefan? No? No?
Maybe I come in later.
Yeah. I just wanted to add something. I think one sector where we see it already very well is on the UN institutions.
Oh yes, the multilaterals.
And the multilaterals, no? So those who are very aid dependent on US funding, like WFP, like UNHCR, so they had to cut considerable stuff already. No, they at least announced that.
Clearly, I mean, I think the UN system is going to be, we all know that the UN system is going to be hit considerably, and we don't, you know, at the moment with the UN80, there's an attempt to do a salami slicing and a lot of internal battles about where those cuts are going to come, but clearly the UN is completely going to be remodeled in terms of its reach and the presence of agencies. WFP is a classic example of that, most definitely.
Thank you very much. So maybe I want to go to Stefan. This reduction of foreign aid, as has been said, it comes along with a profound shift in geopolitics, in the development narrative, in norms, the global institutional architecture. So can you explain a little bit about, elaborate a little bit about this political environment and the institutional consequences?
Yeah. Of course, and first of all, thank you to Bruno Kreisky Forum and ÖFSE for this invitation. I think Bruno Kreisky was a leading figure and really proud to be part of this panel here. Yes, development cooperation very much affected by this kind of geopolitical situation we are facing, but I would also say development cooperation is contributing to this kind of trend. If we are looking at some main challenges, like from a European perspective, the role of China, to understand the role of China on a global scale, to understand how China is playing this development cooperation part is a very important one. Let me just give you three quick thoughts on how I'm looking at this. First of all, I would agree with Catherine. What we are seeing now is not really a totally new thing since January 2025, when Trump returned to White House, but we saw already over the last couple of years a much more interest-focused development cooperation trend. And let me just quickly say 3 examples or main dimensions. One is development cooperation and geopolitics and geoeconomics. I think this is very striking. Catherine mentioned already support to Ukraine. Ukraine is still regarded a developing country, and there's a lot of official development assistance in support of Ukraine. So this is a very substantive contribution. So in the case of Germany, for example, 2 billion euro per year. This is not tiny money. We also see the European Union's initiative on Global Gateway. This is very much to compete to a large extent with China's infrastructure initiative, Belt and Road Initiative. And this is a huge initiative with private resources, public resources. When it comes to public resources, very much also development cooperation based. And this is very much in the interest of Europe. A third example, just looking at access to minerals and energy. This is also something what is increasingly part of the development cooperation portfolio. Yeah? If you look at a number of countries, recipient countries like Namibia, Morocco, and others. A second quite important area is climate finance, which is close to 100% coming from development cooperation funds in the case of Austria, but this is also the case for many other OECD donor countries. This is not to complain about it, but just to see this kind of trend over the years. And the third very important thing is those migration deals, mainly by the European Union, with Tunisia, with Mauritania, with Egypt, with other countries. Development cooperation is also part of those migration deals with a very strong self-interest to manage the situation, to reduce the number of migrants coming to Europe. Yeah? This is not an easy topic, but just flagging, this was already happening over the last 3, 5, 7, 8 years. And I would say this is probably the main trend for development cooperation already for quite a while.
So
then
so if I just may interrupt you, so what you're saying basically, has changed was the kind of the objective or the look at of the development cooperation, which has been done previously in, or if we wanted to have done in the interest of the recipient country, and has turned more to be kind of self-interested or something, a cooperation interested in in donor interests.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I would totally agree. I mean, the beginning of development cooperation since the early 60s was very much related to the Cold War. Yeah, that was the rationale for the beginning. Then we had, after the Cold War, the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, a bit this kind of high time of aid effectiveness, how to make the best use of resources in the interest of partner countries. And this has changed since the 2010s and especially for the last couple of years. So very much interest-based approach. A second one, which is, and this is already this kind of norm setting behind, and how does it interplay with bigger international relations topics. What I would say, what we saw already and what is now speeding up since Trump took again the presidency in the United States, is that our traditional norms on development cooperation and international cooperation are really eroding. Let me give you some examples in this regard. One is looking at the last United Nations General Assembly from September. What we see is a very much narrow discussion about the mandate of the United Nations on peace and security. This is relevant, but it's excluding, to a large extent, sustainable development topics, but also human rights. If you look at that the United States is framing the Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as something what is against American interest, this is really the erosion of a very fundamental soft governance structure we had so far, and it's also trickling down, coming to Europe. If you look at the Green Deal of the European Union, how we are now increasingly watering this kind of discussion. But it's also about some more, let's say, technical norms. I think the 0.7% goal, we all know it. We can discuss is it useful or not. But in a way, until 2-3 years ago, it was agreed, and all heads of state in Europe and US would say, we don't achieve it, but we believe in it. Mm-hmm. What we now have is a number of countries explicitly saying, we want to reduce our contribution to this goal. We want to reduce it. I mean, in Sevilla, in the Finance for Development conference for the European Union, there's still the 0.7% goal. Mm-hmm. But if you go to member countries, to Germany, just to blame my own country, maybe also relevant for other countries, on the national level, we have governments and parliaments saying, no, we do not want to achieve this, we want to cut it by 50%. Yeah, this is reality. So we have really this kind of erosion of norms on development cooperation, but even beyond. And this is something I think Catherine indicated, all these consequences because of the financial cuts. This is a very significant thing. But those norm aspects, this is the future of development cooperation. So if our decision makers, if our public is not believing any longer is in international cooperation, in development cooperation, we shouldn't expect that those countries will invest in development cooperation in 5 years and 10 years.
Can I just come in here? Because whilst I would agree with you that there has been an erosion of norms as professed, that's very explicit now. In the part, it's very explicit, self-interested, negotiated, or whatever, deals logic, transactional, that's the word. I would suggest that development cooperation has always had in its gut self-interest. And, from the global majority, the global south, the countries on whom development gets done, it's always been very clear that this was not benevolence on the part of OECD DAC donors. So that's the first thing. And I think that there is something about now where the interest-centered nature of cooperation is at least clear to everybody. And so that gives the countries who are the would-be recipients of development aid to have a different kind of conversation. So in all this tumult about the end of, you keep hearing these recourses to, is this an opportunity for doing things differently? Of course, there is no level playing field, but I want to suggest that in this changing geopolitical space we're in, there are openings to also consider that OECD DAC donors are not the only show in town. You referred to China earlier. But there are a whole host of other actors that are, irrespective of what OECD DAC donors are doing, are engaging and have been for some time with those recipients of development assistance who are now, stranded by the decisions of OECD DAC donors. So I would caution against reading into this explicit narrative as the change, because I think things are naked now. And if you listen to global majority voices articulating, what they want now, moving forward, they're thinking beyond resurrection of a 0.7, even though that's very articulated in Seville. But all those other things that generate and engender deep inequality. So trade, debt, IP, intellectual property, you know, those sorts of things are all part and parcel of the things that are keeping and sustaining the underdevelopment, if you like, of a number of countries. So I do think this is a really interesting, difficult, but very interesting time to kind of, for that unraveling and the kind of, I'm not necessarily saying the global majority will gain and benefit from this, but I do think it opens up the space for a different kind of conversation.
Irene, if you want to encourage us to have a dialogue, I could...
It's all right.
But if you want to stop me here, it's also fine.
I can stop you afterwards, but please go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, I think very good points. Yeah. But what I would respond is, let's say in the past we had this kind of double standards, hypocrisy, yeah, you know, preaching something, not walking the talk, all this. But the issue is, if we have now heads of state explicitly saying, I'm not believing any longer in sustainable development. It doesn't exist. I'm not interested.
You're referring to
one important president from Northern America. And I think some are doing some kind of copy-paste also in Europe. Yeah. Then we have a different issue because we do not have a point of reference. I mean, as civil society, as NGOs, as members of parliament, we are not saying, let's at least try to go this direction, because now we are not interested any longer. So that's a quite fundamental thing. That's one point. And the other one, and this is, I think, something what I would use in a positive way, we are looking at China as Europeans, also a number of other OECD countries, in a way that China is very successful when it comes to its narratives, also with infrastructure, all this. And we do not understand this in a way, the Chinese way of development cooperation. So we want to have a better relationship with the Global South. We want to compete with China. We want to do all this. But at the same time, we do not relate this to our own debate on development cooperation. Right. So this is a bit a strange situation.
You want to reply directly?
No, I mean, I think
but I very much appreciate your point, and you brought us actually quite right to the Sevilla conference. So, and what you say. So, if we say that we lose the direction of SDGs, we lose the narrative, and we lose the social consensus of we want to engage with the Global South via, among others, via development cooperation. So this is one thing what we as Western countries definitely lose, I understand. So you say there is an opportunity for development countries to focus more on other structural imbalances. And maybe you want to elaborate a little bit on that, because actually there is a point for developing countries for years have focused on their difficult access to financial market, the high interest rates that they are paying, even if they are less indebted than a European country, they are paying higher interest rates. So, or the difficult access also to, or the structure of what the World Bank is, the governance structures of the IMF and the World Bank, which are really westernized, let's say westernized and Western government structures, and it is always Western countries who oppose these changes. But maybe you want to elaborate a little bit and to explain a little bit there.
Yes, I mean, thank you. I think, yeah, there is certainly, I would agree that there's this lack of meeting of minds, if you like, around the, what's the future of development cooperation, and then the other possible ways in which developing country donors can pivot and support a different set of outcomes. I do think there were some interesting things that happened in Seville around this, however. I mean, Seville, the Financing for Development Conference, of course the US wasn't there, but it still demonstrated that there was a commitment to some kind of multi-stakeholder, multilateral forum, right? And the ambition was quite high. I mean, one interesting thing that we have written about is the presence of the MDBs at Seville, the multilateral development banks.
Yeah.
Not only were they there, but the conversations that they were part of and, you know, were all about leveraging. So we know that even though, for example, the UK and many DAC donors have cut their bilateral aid, they're still investing in MDBs, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the logic of bigger bang for your buck, because the MDBs, multilateral development banks, can if they can use public funds to leverage private finance, they can triple, quadruple the overall quantum, the overall amount. And so there was a conversation in Seville, for the first time that the MDBs were there, which suggests that there might be, it might not be all bleak moving forward. Of course, the issues around representation, borrower countries, the position of borrower countries in these multilateral development banks, that's the big question, the degrees to which they're able to have concessional finance rather than, overly high interest rate loans. I mean, I think that is where the rubber really hits the road. But at least there was a glimmer of hope there, their presence, but also the idea that even if, bilateral aid is being cut, there can be innovative ways of using that aid to partner with other institutions, they'll channel it through other fora rather than bilaterally, or work more effectively with philanthropy, the private sector. So I do believe, and ODI has never been a stickler on the 0.7, by the way, because we have always insisted that it is on the plethora of other areas that we really need to focus attention, terms of trade, access to intellectual property, and so on, that we can really make a difference. And one, I'll just put it out there, because you referenced the figure on, development aid really being used for climate finance, and there is always that conversation, that debate about what gets counted. Notwithstanding that, I mean, I think the bigger question, particularly if you're thinking about Africa, is how Africa can actually use this moment to think of transition as an opportunity for green industrialization, right? So the question for us would be, in what ways does the reduction of aid that is more channeled through multilateral vehicles enable, Africa to achieve its ambition of ultimately an industrialization? Because ultimately, it is that's going to really start to break the back on the big poverty challenges the continent faces. So, I mean, it kind of relates back to what I was saying about, whilst this is a moment that is bleak in many respects, it also, I think, gives us an opportunity to have those more, those more important conversations about to what end. And I do think, just to kind of square the circle, how can we build a narrative or a rationale around development that sticks, that appeals to publics? I mean, if you just putting the development challenge to one side, we are in a moment in history of deep instability across the board in all countries, globally. And, the rise of populisms, the new narratives around what is right and fitting to do, go beyond the development conversation. So my pragmatic political economy head would be to say, you know, how within this context can we craft a narrative that appeals around the purpose? And some of the conversations that ODI has been hosting have spoken around, you know, thinking about a new discourse on development which sees it as a global public good and global security as a global public good, of which investment in development goods are part of that. So rather than pitch development as a moral and ethical ambition, I know there are trade-offs, but you embrace the zeitgeist and explore it as something in the interests of you know, donor countries to consider, rather than something that's not self-interested, but actually it is part of a kind of contribution to their own security.
Thank you for your, what do you say, optimistic pragmatism. Or pragmatic optimism. That was pragmatic optimism that you said. No, thank you for that. I think it is very much bringing a kind of lots of new aspects or different aspects into the discussion. But do you think, I just want to return the question, that this exploring these other opportunities is so realistic for countries which are, if you look at how much countries are paying for their sovereign debt. So one of the big battles in Sevilla was also a debt restructuring, and which didn't succeed.
No, I mean, I don't think that issue goes away. I still think it's a big elephant in the room, but I think it is only through more effective representation of borrower countries in global financial institutions that you actually get any traction around that. And the issue I raised around pushing for concessional finance rather than, you know, is part of that. Okay. The conversation on international, you know, illicit financial flows is also part of the same things that have been pushed, for example, by the G20 led by South Africa. They've been very big on that. So I don't think these things go away, but perhaps they get packaged within a different discourse.
Stefan, all these systemic imbalances are not new. So these have been in the discussions, in particular in this global fora, for years already. So, and in particular also the governance of IMF and World Bank is also an elephant in the room. And so far it has always been the US, European countries who are blocking that, any move on that. So what's the interest of, what's our interest in not moving ahead on that? If we have so many difficulties to give something bilaterally, so why can't we move, even if it's our own interest that developing world is actually developing?
I mean, maybe let me respond with 2 points, and in a way I also agree with what Catherine is saying, but my framing or nuances would be a bit different. One is what we discuss here as instability or crisis of the situation. When I'm traveling to African countries, to Asian countries, this is not a crisis, this is not instability, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity of business cases, of new relationships. So we look at the situation, development cooperation resources are going down. Investments of European countries in Africa are going down. All this, this is something what we see as a negative trend. And of course, from a European perspective it is, but from a perspective of an African country, situation is quite a different one, because China is now the most important trading partner for the majority of African countries. This kind of Trump-focused discussion in Asian countries, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, much less strong focus what their perspective is, and this is, I think, a very important trend already happening for a couple of years, but now really speeding up, is what I would say of frame contestation of existing structures. And contestation has two options. One is to challenge existing governance structures. This is what is happening at all places. United Nations, how representatives of the G77, etc., are speaking up about the need to give at least 2 permanent seats of the Security Council to African countries. It comes to World Bank, it comes to IMF. It's really a challenge. Second one is to create parallel institutions. BRICS, in a way, the new development bank. All this is a new universe of institutions. China is announcing a 0% tariff approach with all African countries, including the middle-income countries. This is a challenge to the West. So what I want to say is, yes, for Europe, it should be also for the US, for other OECD countries, it's a very challenging situation. It's a trend where we are losing influence. But for majority of developing countries, actors from the global south, this is a big opportunity. So this kind of, I think, we need to deal with consequences of cutting aid, all this. My fear would be a bit, this will be not substituted soon by more domestic resources. I mean, it could happen, but we will probably see less investments in health, etc. But with a more midterm, long-term perspective, those additional opportunities because of what Arab countries are doing, what India is doing, what China is doing, to some extent also Russia, this is seen as an opportunity. I mean, if you look at those countries which are really tricky, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, the role of Russia, how they bring in this kind of nuclear power dimension, which is a bit overlooked from a European perspective, I would say. This is a very important game changer. I mean, Russia has not a lot of things to offer. This is, I mean, this kind of militia approach plus nuclear power, but this is very powerful, and this gives a lot of power to those countries. I'm not saying I like this, but this is a reality. So if you're a leader in a Western African country, in a Sahel country, I mean, that France is now pushed out. This is not seen as, oh, we are losing now some ODA money. This gives us a lot of power, additional resources, etc. So this kind of different perspective, I still think we need to understand it. It's a little bit like many Western leaders were surprised by how developing countries were voting at the UN General Assembly after Russia did this fully fledged invasion in February 2022. You remember this? Macron saying, oh, we thought we have so many friends on the African continents, but now they are voting in a way which is really strange. I'm not, you know, arguing in favor of those voting patterns, but it was a surprise to us. And this kind of situation that the rest of the world perceives the situation also as a crisis is not true for many, many countries in the world.
Thank you. But before you both are painting this picture a little bit too bright for developing countries, one, I just want to remind that there are on the, I don't know, on the Malawis and on the Nigers and on the Burkinabes of this world, so which are, I think, not so brightly participating in all these new perspectives. And on the other side also, with this cut of development aid, we are also looking at at two things. One, at the cut of humanitarian support, and I think that there are no bright alternative to that, and which has also a huge impact on crisis. And secondly, to all the how to say, the international consensus around the UN on a rules-based international system. Because if we have a little bit of Arab, a little bit of Russian, a little bit of Chinese, a little bit of that and that, which may give a lot of choice, but I remember just the speech of the Prime Minister of Barbados at the UN, and she said, we only can exist in a rules-based international system. Otherwise, we cease to exist. We have no power at all as a small country. So how would you see, or how would you comment on that?
It's a very
one on the humanitarian part, I think, which is very important, and if we because there actually what we are seeing is a breakdown of the humanitarian system as a whole, and so this is one thing, and the other thing is what's about the UN and the normative power of the UN.
Big questions. I mean, I think on the humanitarian side, clearly, you know, the dramatic cuts, you know, will have an impact, have had an impact. You know, the US was the largest, remains the largest humanitarian donor, by the way, despite the cuts. Yes, despite the cuts, still the biggest, but relative to the others. What I would say is that this is clearly a very challenging moment for the humanitarian system. But our perspective is that the humanitarian system has been for such a long time in desperate need of reform. And we would like to see, I would like to see this as an opportunity for some of the burning questions around how local humanitarian actors are taken seriously as part of the front line of humanitarian action. I'd like to see a greater reform of the humanitarian system that's actually building in local actors as the key kind of linchpin. We know that waste, inefficiency has plagued the humanitarian system, and inertia for a very, very long time. ODI at the moment is hosting a high-level panel, advisory panel, on the future of international humanitarian action. We're hosting it in collaboration with the NEAR Foundation, which is a network of local humanitarian actors across the world. And we hope that the conversations there will actually feed into the official humanitarian reset that's taking place through the UN system. So I don't want to belittle the impact of the cuts to the humanitarian system, nor the big, huge political dilemmas and challenges and real problems with the breakdown of respect for international humanitarian law, that is the context within which these budget cuts are taking place. But those challenges are hyper-political, you know, rather than about systemic fixes. So, you know, we have to differentiate the system-wide need for transformation from the political instrumentalization of the humanitarian of humanitarian action as a big problem that we'll have to face. And of course, the Gaza situation is replete with examples of the way in which that erosion of norms, and in fact, you know, complete disregard of international law has set a new trajectory that we need to be really concerned about, which you know, we're very, very, very worried that will set a new tone.
Okay.
Yeah. Those two questions, maybe quickly on humanitarian aid. I mean, we know that when it comes to UN humanitarian aid, more than 40% came from the US in the past. So that's a significant portion. At the same time, you all also understand this contribution by the US was not always something what was just nice and good. It was mainly what US farmers produced. So exactly what you are saying, not buying from local markets, etc., etc. We know that the UN system is in a desperate need, more than 15 humanitarian agencies. And we also know that a lot of humanitarian aid at the moment is focused on Gaza and Ukraine. There are huge needs, but we are overlooking to a large extent situations like Sudan, like Yemen and others. And this kind of what is missing, this gap is now for the first time so huge that the humanitarian coordinator is really for good reasons complaining about it. And this UN80 reform initiative might on an institutional level bring some kind of improvement. When it comes to this rule of law question, I mean, again, all those topics are quite complex. I think my main point would be, from my experience, that most leaders, including thinking leaders from global southern countries, would say that the system in the past was not fair. Yeah, what we call rule of law, etc., was a system, yes, with some regulations, but we were norm takers, you were norm setters, and we were suffering. To see a situation where this system is now changing is not something what is bad per se, but something what might lead to a better situation. And I think what we mainly see is, I mean, I like and dislike at the same time this kind of multi-alignment term, but that for countries that they have really those choices, issue-based, not a fixed coalition with the West or with a different group, but if you find a good agreement on access to the Chinese market, you do this. If you find an agreement with the UK on a different topic, you do it. So you do not have any longer this kind of fixed set of alliances, but really something where each country can try to use its opportunities.
Good. Can I just say one small little point? Tiny.
Yeah, very tiny.
Very tiny.
Because I want
yes,
to
very,
give
very
the
tiny. Just to say that we
questions
have to be careful, I think, when we talk about, you know, we mustn't talk in binaries, right? So when we talk about the global majority, I mean, I just want to think about, you know, women's organizations who are that are crying out for the defense of a rule-based order.
Of course.
Because of the protections it affords. Yes. And very clearly, all our work on human rights and gender rights and so is about ensuring that we don't allow the unravelling of that. So there are different constituencies in the global majority that I think we always need to be, when we speak in this general way, we need to know who we're speaking for. Thank you. That was short.
Yeah. No, that's what I want. What I wanted to focus on also. There are certain norms I think that we all need quite desperately. So I want to come to an end here on the panel, or to close the panel, and to give the and to give to give the word to the floor. But just before, so just a short one statement of each of you. So, coming back to development cooperation and international aid, so where do you see the future, and how do you think that development organizations, NGOs, institutions, organizations here, how should they position themselves? question to both of you. You can start.
This time I can start. Okay, okay.
You can start, yeah.
Great.
So she has some time to reflect.
I think that the first point is really to discuss, to deal with this kind of new reality. So it's much less about solidarity, much less about values. It's much more that development cooperation and development is very much related to geopolitics and geoeconomics. And this is already one step to accept it, to deal with it, and that our area is part of it. My second one is we really need to deal with this kind of what is the rational, what is the narrative of development and development cooperation. I think I was saying a number of things why this system is in a crisis, and especially also seen from beyond European countries, seen it in this way, but I would still try to make a case for it, because it's about sustainable development, also very much in our interest, and we need to bring this kind of new narrative to the public, to decision makers, in a time where populist groups are much more important. And this would bring me to my last point. I would think of our agendas, our thinking. The changes in Austria, in other European countries and beyond are very much driven by populist right-wing groups. And this is something what is not just taking place at the level of United Nations New York or EU in Brussels or OECD in Paris, but this is the neighborhood just next to us, how people are thinking. Yeah? It's about our children, how they are educated at school, etc. So this kind of trying to make a contribution in our local communities is something what is highly relevant, a very important investment today and tomorrow. So I really see this kind of strong need to start with the roots of our communities here in our countries to make an investment in sustainable development with a long-term perspective.
Thank you. I would very much agree, but I have to say something different. So I would try. I was going to say something about acknowledging that we are not the only ones, or we, whoever that we is, are not the only ones in the room. So when we're speaking about developing countries, that we acknowledge the presence of others with influence. And whilst we might like to, if you think Global Gateway, the logic is competitiveness, we might also want to think beyond competitiveness and how we can contribute and also gain from engaging. Because, as you said, growth in OECD countries is not is not going up, not in any way near how it needs to accommodate needs. And so there are opportunities. I really liked what you said about opportunities. However, I would also say that we need to be quite cautious of that opportunities narrative, because there is a new scramble taking place. There is a new scramble taking place relative to those opportunities, a new scramble taking place relative to those opportunities, which is about looking at critical minerals, for example, looking at energy security. And if you look at the infrastructural developments in Africa, for example, they're really mimicking a colonial logic of ports, getting minerals out and so on. The Lupita Corridor is exactly that. And we know what happened. We know all the things we know about how extractives lead to conflict and so on and so forth, if not. So I would say that yes, think opportunity, but learn lessons from the past as well, and be ambitious for ourselves, but also the would-be developing countries. What I said about green industrialization in Africa is what African leadership believes in. You know, the AFCTFTA, the African Free Trade Agreement, is all about that. So I would encourage us to get with the programme, see who else is in the room, and the ambitions that are being developed. And just the final point I would make would be about imagination. You spoke about narrative. You know, I found myself in the last 6 months, 8 months, however long it's been since the cuts, being quite frustrated about the refrain. There is public antipathy towards development. It is clear, it is widespread, it is OECD-wide. And whilst that can be documented, I also think there is a narrative that is a self-fulfilling prophecy that gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and so it becomes fact. I do think there's work to be done in upending that narrative, investing not just in community, but in the production of a new imaginary around what we gain from, you know, investing in would-be developing countries, engaging with other actors who are there, not necessarily as competitors, but also as part, you know, moving in the same direction. So I do think there's work to be done in constructing that narrative, and I do think it has to be taken very seriously and invested in, just as the alternative narratives have been taken seriously and invested in, which puts us where we are today.
Thank you very much. So I want to give the word to the floor.